My name is Chloe Davis. I am 23 years old. 5 years ago, I stood perfectly still in my family's living room in the Chicago suburbs and watched my father throw my future into a brick fireplace. He held my Harvard acceptance letter up to the light, flicked his silver lighter, and set the heavy parchment on fire. I did not scream. I did not cry. I just watched the edges curl into black ash while my mother stood silently behind him, holding the remaining 7 envelopes. "You are staying home to help your brother succeed," my father Richard said. He tossed the burning paper onto the logs and reached for the Yale envelope next. "Chase needs a quiet house to launch his business. We need you working full-time at the diner to help cover his startup costs. Family supports family, Chloe." He thought he burned all 8 of my college acceptances that night. He thought he had successfully trapped me in a minimum wage life to serve as an ATM for my older brother's delusions. What my father did not know was that the most important letter of all, a full-ride scholarship to Columbia University, was currently folded flat inside my left Converse sneaker. Before I tell you how I returned to that exact same living room 5 years later in a $120,000 car, wearing a tailored suit they could never afford, to deliver news that would permanently destroy their perfect illusion, please take a second to like and subscribe. Only do it if you believe toxic families deserve exactly what they give. Also, I would love to know where you are watching from today and what time it is right now. Drop a comment and let me know. Now let me take you back to the night I walked out forever. To understand why my father burned my achievements, you have to understand the Davis family dynamic. In our house, my older brother Chase was the undisputed center of the universe. Chase was loud. Chase was demanding. Chase was a visionary, at least according to my parents. By the time I was in high school, Chase had already dropped out of 2 different state colleges. Every time he failed, my parents blamed the professors, the curriculum, or the environment. When he decided he was going to be a tech entrepreneur, they remortgaged our house to fund his lifestyle. I was the invisible daughter. I learned early on that my grades, my test scores, and my ambitions were seen as threats to Chase's fragile ego. When I brought home straight-A report cards, my mother Susan would quickly hide them in a drawer so Chase would not feel bad about his own failures. I spent 4 years studying in secret. I applied to top-tier schools late at night on a battered laptop I bought at a garage sale. I paid the application fees myself, using tip money from my weekend job waiting tables. I knew education was my only ticket out of a house that treated me like a servant. When the thick envelopes started arriving in the mail, I made the fatal mistake of leaving them on the kitchen counter. I thought maybe just for 1 second my parents would be proud of me. Instead, they saw my escape plan and decided to burn it to the ground. But they underestimated exactly how much fire I could walk through. I did not scream when the letters burned. I did not fall to my knees or beg my father to stop. I did not shed a single tear while he stood there holding his silver lighter, looking incredibly satisfied with himself. I had spent 18 years learning that in the Davis household, any display of negative emotion was considered a direct attack on my parents' peace. If I cried, my mother Susan would accuse me of being manipulative. If I yelled, my father Richard would tell me I was ungrateful and unstable. But more importantly, I knew that reacting would only give them the satisfaction of breaking me. They wanted me to accept my designated role as the supporting character in the grand tragedy of my older brother Chase and his endless string of failures. So I stood in the living room inhaling the acrid smell of burning paper and maintained a perfectly blank expression. When the last envelope curled into white ash, my father dusted his hands together. He gave me a stern paternal nod as if he had just done me a massive favor. He told me to go to sleep because I had a morning shift at the diner and Chase needed the house quiet to work on his business plan. I said goodnight, I turned around, and I walked up the carpeted stairs to my bedroom. I closed the door without slamming it. I sat on the edge of my narrow twin bed and waited. I waited for the television downstairs to turn off. I waited for the heavy footsteps of my father walking down the hall. I waited for the click of my parents' bedroom door locking. I stared at the digital clock on my nightstand, watching the glowing red numbers change. 10:30, 11:15, midnight, 1 in the morning. I did not move. My heart was beating so hard against my ribs, I thought the sound might echo through the drywall, but my hands were completely steady. At exactly 2 in the morning, I finally bent down and untied my left Converse sneaker. I slipped my foot out and reached inside the shoe. Beneath the cheap foam insole, pressed completely flat, was the thick, cream-colored parchment of my Columbia University acceptance letter. I pulled it out and smoothed the creases with my thumbs. The official university seal gleamed in the dim light of my desk lamp. It was a full-ride academic scholarship. It covered tuition, housing, and a small living stipend. It was $1 million piece of paper that I had intercepted from the mail carrier 3 days earlier. I knew my father was destroying my mail. I had noticed my rejection letters arriving, but mysteriously missing my acceptances. The day the Columbia letter arrived, I met the mailman at the end of the driveway, shoved the thick envelope into my shoe, and walked back into the house, acting as if the mailbox was empty. Looking at the letter now in the quiet dark of my childhood bedroom, I felt a cold, hard surge of pure adrenaline. This was my proof of life. This was the undeniable evidence that I was worth more than a minimum wage paycheck designated for my brother's whimsical tech startup. Chase was 25 years old, living in our basement, launching his third imaginary company. His first was a custom t-shirt business that went bankrupt in 6 months. His second was a lifestyle podcast that cost my parents $10,000 in audio equipment and generated exactly 0 listeners. Now he was pitching an app. He did not know how to code. He did not know how to build a financial model. But my parents remortgaged our house anyway because Chase was the golden boy and his success was going to validate their entire existence. I was just the spare daughter, the hired help, the safety net they could exploit when the money ran out. I stood up and pulled a faded black canvas duffel bag from the back of my closet. I did not pack memories. I did not pack photographs or childhood stuffed animals or high school yearbooks. I packed 3 pairs of jeans, 5 shirts, underwear, socks, and my battered laptop. I went to my dresser and opened the bottom drawer. I reached far into the back corner and pulled out a rolled-up pair of winter socks. Inside was $400 in cash. It was graduation money sent by distant relatives. My mother had explicitly told me to hand over any graduation gifts for the household fund, which was her polite way of saying it would go toward paying off Chase's credit card debt. I had lied and told her I only received greeting cards. I stuffed the $400 deep into the pocket of my jeans. I put on a dark jacket and slung the duffel bag over my shoulder. I looked around the room one last time, and I crept down the stairs holding my breath. The floorboards creaked softly, but the sound of my father snoring masked the noise. I crept down the stairs, holding my breath. I walked into the kitchen. The moonlight filtered through the blinds, casting long shadows across the linoleum floor. I took my house keys off my keychain. I placed them gently on the kitchen island right next to the coffee maker, where my father would find them when he woke up to serve Chase his morning coffee. The metallic clink of the keys hitting the granite countertop was the most final sound I had ever heard. I walked out the back door and stepped into the cool Chicago night air. The Greyhound bus station was 3 miles away in the commercial district. I did not call a taxi. I did not want a digital paper trail, and I needed to conserve every single dollar I had. I started walking. I walked past the manicured lawns and the 2-car garages of my suburban neighborhood. I looked at the dark windows of the houses, wondering how many other families were hiding rot behind their freshly painted front doors. The physical toll of carrying a heavy duffel bag for 3 miles was nothing compared to the mental weight I was leaving behind. Every step I took away from that house felt like shedding a layer of heavy lead. By the time I reached the bus terminal, it was almost 4 in the morning. The station was bathed in harsh, flickering, fluorescent light. It smelled like stale coffee, diesel fuel, and desperation. I walked up to the ticket counter. The clerk looked at me with completely indifferent eyes. I asked for the next one-way ticket to New York City. He typed on his keyboard and told me it was $95. I peeled the bills from my roll of cash and slid them under the glass partition. He handed me a paper ticket and pointed to Gate 4. The bus ride took 14 agonizing hours. I sat in a window seat near the back, watching the American Midwest blur past the dirty glass. The engine rumbled beneath me, vibrating through my bones. Passengers got on and off at random stops in Ohio and Pennsylvania. Some people slept, some people argued on their phones. I stayed perfectly awake. I did not cry once. Crying is a luxury reserved for people who have a safety net to fall into when they break. I was in complete freefall. If I shattered, there would be absolutely no one to sweep up the pieces. So I focused my mind on survival. I visualized the layout of Manhattan. I memorized the subway routes I had researched. I turned my anger into a solid weapon, a shield I could carry into the city. But no amount of visualization could prepare me for the reality of stepping off that bus at the Port Authority bus terminal in Manhattan. The moment the automatic doors slid open, I was hit by a physical wall of noise, smell, and sheer human velocity. Thousands of people were moving with aggressive purpose. Yellow cabs blared their horns outside. The buildings towered over the streets, blocking out the sun and turning the avenues into deep concrete canyons. I stood on the sidewalk, gripping the strap of my duffel bag tightly. I pulled out my acceptance letter again to remind myself why I was here. I had the scholarship. I had the admission. But as I looked at the fine print, the first wave of true panic hit me. The scholarship covered housing, but dorm move-in day was not for another 2 weeks. I was completely alone in the most expensive city in the country with $300 in my pocket. I had no apartment. I had no cosigner. I had no emergency contact. My biological family probably thought I was dead in a ditch somewhere. And worse, they probably felt relieved they did not have to feed me anymore. I realized very quickly that the battle was not over just because I escaped my father's living room. In fact, the war was just beginning. I had to figure out how to survive the next 14 days on the streets of New York without getting eaten alive. And I had to do it while maintaining the grades required to keep my $1 million lifeline. I took a deep breath of the thick, exhaust-filled air, slung my bag over my shoulder, and walked straight into the chaos. The first 14 days in New York City before the university dormitories officially opened were a masterclass in sheer human desperation. I spent my nights sitting in a 24-hour diner in Queens, nursing a single $2 cup of black coffee until the waitress took pity on me and stopped asking me to leave. I slept in short, paranoid bursts, with my arms wrapped tightly around my canvas duffel bag. I washed my face and brushed my teeth in the public restrooms of the Port Authority bus terminal. I ate plain bagels and calculated exactly how many calories I needed to simply keep moving forward. I was absolutely terrified. But beneath the terror was a burning metallic core of pure defiance. I was not going to break. If my father wanted me to fail so my brother could shine, I was going to make sure my success blinded them all. When move-in day finally arrived, I walked through the wrought iron gates of Columbia University, feeling like an imposter who had successfully bypassed the security guards. The campus was stunning. It was a manicured fortress of neoclassical architecture and sprawling green lawns right in the middle of Manhattan. But the contrast between my reality and the reality of my classmates was completely suffocating. I watched parents unloading brand new luxury SUVs, pulling out designer bedding, mini fridges, and expensive laptop computers. Mothers were crying and hugging their daughters. Fathers were taking proud photographs. I walked to my assigned dorm room alone, carrying the same faded duffel bag I had packed in the dark. I had exactly $42 left to my name. I knew the full-ride academic scholarship covered my tuition and my room, but it did not cover the physical cost of staying alive in New York. Textbooks cost hundreds of dollars. Food was brutally expensive. The subway was a daily drain. Within 48 hours of arriving on campus, I secured 2 jobs. I worked the graveyard shift at the main campus library from midnight to 6 in the morning, organizing returned books and resetting the study rooms. Then I would sleep for exactly 2 hours before walking 3 blocks to an off-campus coffee shop where I worked the morning rush from 8 until noon, serving espresso to impatient, wealthy professionals. After that, I went to class. The physical exhaustion was profound. There were days when my hands shook so badly from caffeine and sleep deprivation that I could barely read my own lecture notes. But no matter how deeply my bones ached, the exhaustion was nothing compared to the suffocating psychological weight of my childhood home. In my dorm room, I was tired, but I was free. I did not have to tiptoe around a grown man throwing a tantrum because his imaginary tech company was failing. I did not have to listen to my mother make excuses for him. But I could not completely escape the reality of what was happening back in Chicago. Even though I had changed my phone number, I still occasionally checked the public social media profiles of my extended family, just to see the slow-moving train wreck I had left behind. Chase was still living in the basement. He had abandoned his podcast idea and was now fully invested in developing an app that crowdsourced ratings for luxury dog food. It was a completely useless idea in a saturated market, but my parents treated it like he had just cured a major disease. Through a careless Facebook post from an aunt, I learned that my father had cashed out a massive portion of his retirement savings to pay a boutique firm to design Chase's app logo. I sat in the campus library at 3 in the morning, staring at my bank account balance, which currently sat at $18, and thought about my father casually handing over $50,000 for a digital drawing of a dog bone. It was in that exact moment, sitting under the harsh fluorescent lights, surrounded by thousands of books, that a terrifying realization washed over me. Surviving was not going to be enough. Getting a degree from Columbia and securing a stable $80,000 a year corporate job was not going to protect me. My parents were financially reckless and deeply tied to my brother's inevitable ruin. When they eventually went completely bankrupt, when the bank came to take their house and their cars, they would come looking for me. They would look at my stable job and demand that I uphold my duty to the family. They would try to drag me right back into the financial black hole they had created for Chase. If I was just comfortable, they would bleed me dry. I did not need to be comfortable. I needed to become completely, permanently untouchable. I needed the kind of wealth and power that built walls so high my family could not even see the top of them. The turning point happened during the spring semester of my sophomore year. I was working the Tuesday morning rush at the coffee shop, wiping down the steam wand on the espresso machine. The shop was located near a major financial hub and was a popular spot for venture capitalists and investment bankers to hold informal meetings before heading into their glass towers. 2 men in bespoke wool suits were sitting at the counter waiting for their orders. They were speaking loudly, completely unconcerned with who could hear them. "We just lost $12 million on that logistics startup," the older man said, rubbing his temples in frustration. "The pitch deck was flawless. The founder had the pedigree, but the internal burn rate was toxic, and our predictive models totally missed the behavioral red flags of the executive team." The younger man sighed and stirred his coffee. "The problem is the algorithm. Every major venture capital firm in the city is using the same outdated risk assessment software. It looks at market trends and historical data, but it cannot predict when a startup founder is making emotionally driven, desperate financial decisions. If someone could build a back-end software that accurately flags the early behavioral indicators of startup failure before the money burns, we would buy it tomorrow for 10 times the valuation." I stopped wiping the counter. My heart slammed against my ribs so hard, I felt it in my throat. Algorithmic risk assessment, predicting startup failure based on behavioral financial decisions. I knew exactly what they were talking about, because I had lived it. For the past year, I had been quietly teaching myself how to code in my dorm room. It started as a coping mechanism. I was trying to mathematically understand why my parents were so blind to Chase's failures. I started building complex spreadsheets to track the timeline of his bankruptcies. I inputted the initial capital he received, the burn rate of the cash, the unnecessary luxury expenses he prioritized over actual product development, and the point of inevitable collapse. I turned my brother's entire life into a set of data points. Then I taught myself Python and began building a predictive algorithm just to see if a computer could identify the exact moment a business was doomed before the humans involved realized it. I was essentially building the exact back-end risk assessment software these venture capitalists were desperately looking for. And I was using my golden child brother as the ultimate baseline for spectacular failure. I handed the men their coffees and practically ran back to my dorm room the moment my shift ended. I did not sleep for the next 3 days. I stopped going to my elective classes. I lived on tap water and stale dining hall crackers. I opened my laptop and began tearing apart my code, rebuilding it from a simple data tracker into a sophisticated predictive financial model. I mapped out the algorithm to analyze thousands of microtransactions, cross-referencing them against industry survival rates. It was a brutal, agonizing process of trial and error, but driven by pure spite and the desperate need to become untouchable. I finally cracked it. I had a working prototype. It was raw and it lacked a polished user interface, but the core mathematics were absolutely infallible. I ran historical data from 50 failed startups through my system, and it correctly predicted their bankruptcy months before their official filings, with 94% accuracy. I held the power to save venture capitalists hundreds of millions of dollars. But having a brilliant piece of software on a battered laptop in a college dorm room was useless unless I could get it in front of the right person. I did not have connections. I did not have a wealthy family to introduce me to angel investors. I was a 20-year-old barista with bags under her eyes and a bank account hovering near zero. I needed a shark. I needed someone ruthless enough to look past my age and see the raw, undeniable value of the weapon I had just built. I started researching the most aggressive technology acquisition firms in Manhattan. I was looking for a specific type of predator, and it did not take long to find her. Her name was Vivian Vance. She was the managing partner of a boutique venture capital firm that specialized in hostile takeovers and aggressive tech acquisitions. The financial magazines called her brilliant, cold, and completely unapproachable. She was exactly what I needed. And as fate would have it, she was scheduled to give a guest lecture at the Columbia University Business School the following week. I knew I was not going to get a polite introduction. I knew she would ignore an email and her assistants would block a phone call. I was going to have to ambush her, and I was going to have to do it with the kind of audacity that would make a shark stop swimming. The war was officially moving from the shadows of my dorm room into the glittering, high-stakes boardrooms of Manhattan. I sat in the very back row of the university lecture hall with my battered laptop resting on my knees. Vivian Vance did not just walk onto the stage, she commanded it. She was wearing a perfectly tailored Tom Ford suit, and her expression was entirely devoid of warmth. She was the managing partner of Vance Capital, a boutique venture capital firm known for executing the most aggressive technology acquisitions in the financial district. For the next hour, I watched her absolutely dismantle the business models of 3 different graduate students. She did not raise her voice. She simply asked sharp, surgical questions that exposed every single flaw in their financial projections until the students were stammering. She possessed a terrifying analytical brilliance. Watching her, I realized she was the exact kind of predator I needed to recognize my work. When the lecture ended, a swarm of ambitious finance students rushed the stage, hoping to hand her their resumes. I did not join them. I knew a woman like Vivian Vance threw uninvited resumes directly into the trash. Instead, I slipped out the back doors of the auditorium and sprinted down the hallway toward the private VIP elevators. I knew from researching her firm that efficiency was her primary religion. She would not wait in the crowded lobby. I stood next to the brushed steel doors of the private elevator and waited. My heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. If campus security caught me ambushing a billionaire alumni donor, I could lose my scholarship and be expelled. But playing it safe had never protected me in my father's house, and it was not going to protect me here. 2 minutes later, Vivian rounded the corner, flanked by a silent executive assistant. She did not even look at me as she stepped into the elevator. Her assistant reached out to block the door, but I moved faster. I stepped right past his arm and wedged myself inside the elevator car just as the doors slid shut. The assistant immediately reached for the security call button, but Vivian held up a single manicured hand, stopping him. She looked at me with cold, dark eyes. She did not look amused. She looked like a shark, calculating whether I was worth the effort of biting. "You have exactly the amount of time it takes this elevator to reach the lobby," she said. Her voice was flat and perfectly calm. "Tell me why you just risked campus security dragging you out of my sight." I did not hesitate. I looked her dead in the eye and spoke with total conviction. "You just told a room full of graduate students that your firm lost $12 million last quarter because your traditional risk assessment models failed to predict a founder's emotional instability. I have spent the last year building a back-end predictive software that flags the exact behavioral indicators of startup failure before the money burns. It analyzes vanity spending, impulsive restructuring, and disproportionate salary withdrawals, and it cross-references them against baseline survival rates. I have run historical data on 50 failed companies through my system. It predicted their bankruptcy filings with 94% accuracy months before the humans involved realized they were doomed. The elevator descended smoothly. Vivian did not blink. She simply stared at me, analyzing every word I had just spoken. "Who funded your research?" she asked. "No one," I replied. "I built it in my dorm room between my overnight shift at the library and my morning shift as a barista. I learned how to track catastrophic financial delusion by watching my parents remortgage their house to fund my older brother's imaginary tech companies. I turned my family's spectacular financial ruin into a mathematical baseline for failure." The elevator chimed, indicating we had reached the ground floor. The doors slid open, revealing the bustling university lobby. Vivian did not step out. She turned to her assistant and told him to cancel her lunch meeting. Then she turned back to me. "Show me the code," she commanded. We sat at a small table in the corner of a quiet campus cafe. I opened my cheap laptop and walked her through the algorithm. I showed her the data points, the behavioral triggers, and the predictive timeline. For 45 minutes, she asked me the most brutal, complex financial questions I had ever heard. I answered every single one of them without a tremor in my voice. When she finally closed my laptop, she leaned back in her chair. "You have a terrible user interface," she said frankly. "The coding is raw and your server security is practically non-existent. But the mathematics are absolutely terrifying. You have the hunger of someone who was starved. I am offering you a paid internship at my firm starting tomorrow morning. You will work directly under my data analytics team to refine this software. If you break under the pressure, I will fire you. If you succeed, we will talk about equity." That internship became the crucible that forged my entire future. For the next 2 years, I lived in a state of highly functional exhaustion. I worked at Vance Capital 70 hours a week while still maintaining my scholarship at Columbia. I stopped sleeping more than 3 hours a night. I stopped having a social life. I existed entirely on espresso and the burning desire to build my fortress. Vivian was a ruthless mentor. She demanded absolute perfection. If I made a mistake in a financial model, she would tear it apart and make me start over from scratch. But unlike my mother who ignored me, or my father who actively sabotaged me, Vivian demanded perfection because she actually believed I was capable of achieving it. For the first time in my life, an adult looked at me and saw limitless potential instead of a burden. By the time I turned 22, the software was complete. We had successfully tested it in real time alongside Vance Capital's traditional risk assessment team. My algorithm successfully flagged 3 catastrophic investments, saving the firm over $40 million in toxic debt. I was sitting in Vivian's massive corner office overlooking the Manhattan skyline when she slid a heavy legal document across her glass desk. It was a term sheet. Vance Capital was offering to seed my software company with $2 million in initial funding. I would retain 60% ownership, and Vivian's firm would take 40% and provide the corporate infrastructure. It was the kind of deal young tech founders dreamed about. But there was a massive, unyielding condition attached to the money. You cannot run a multi-million-dollar financial technology firm between your college classes, Vivian said, pouring herself a glass of sparkling water. If you sign this contract, you have to drop out of Columbia. You have to commit to this empire full time. I sat completely still, staring at the contract. To take the deal, I had to surrender the full-ride academic scholarship that I had smuggled out of my father's house inside my shoe. That acceptance letter had been my only proof of worth. It had been my escape hatch. Dropping out meant throwing away the very safety net I had sacrificed everything to secure. But as I looked at Vivian, I realized that holding on to a safety net is just another way of planning for a fall. I did not want to be safe anymore. I wanted to be a kingmaker. I picked up the heavy silver pen from her desk and signed my name on the dotted line. Dropping out of an Ivy League university to become the CEO of my own predictive analytics firm was the most terrifying and exhilarating decision of my life. With Vivian's aggressive backing and my infallible algorithm, our company exploded. Within 12 months, we were licensing the software to 3 of the largest investment banks on Wall Street. The revenue numbers were staggering. I moved out of my tiny apartment and bought a sprawling penthouse in Tribeca. I bought tailored suits that cost more than my father made in a month. By my 23rd birthday, my company was formally acquired by a massive global banking conglomerate for $15 million. I retained my seat on the board, and Vivian made me the youngest junior partner in the history of her venture capital firm. I had successfully built my fortress. I was a multi-millionaire living in the sky, surrounded by a chosen family of brilliant, ruthless people who respected my mind. I had completely erased myself from my biological family's radar. I never called, I never wrote. I existed as a ghost in their world. But while I was ascending to the absolute peak of the financial food chain, my family in Chicago was rapidly approaching the edge of a cliff. Through a quiet background check run by one of my private investigators, I discovered the exact timeline of their ruin. Chase's luxury dog food app was a spectacular, catastrophic failure. He had burned through every single dollar my parents had given him. He had taken out massive predatory business loans, and my father had blindly co-signed all of them, using their suburban home as collateral. The bank was circling. The debt was entirely unmanageable. They were weeks away from total bankruptcy and foreclosure. They had run out of other people's money. They were desperate, terrified, and looking for a miracle. And as fate would have it, my golden child brother was about to blindly submit a desperate plea for funding to a notoriously aggressive venture capital firm in Manhattan. He had no idea that the silent partner reviewing his catastrophic failure was the exact sister he had driven away in the middle of the night. The collision was finally here. I sat in my glass-walled office on the 42nd floor overlooking the Manhattan skyline and stared at the glossy cover of the pitch deck resting on my desk. It was bound in heavy, expensive leather with the company logo embossed in gold foil. The company was called Posh Paws. It was my brother Chase's grand vision for the future. I slowly turned the thick pages of the presentation, reading through a business model that was so fundamentally flawed, it bordered on comedic. Chase wanted $500,000 in Series A funding to develop a highly exclusive social networking application where owners of purebred dogs could rate and review imported organic dog food. It was a completely useless concept in an already saturated market. He had no active user base. He had no proprietary technology. He had absolutely nothing except a string of buzzwords printed on premium cardstock. But I was not interested in his marketing strategy. I flipped directly to the back of the binder to the financial disclosures appendix. In the world of venture capital, the pitch deck is the fantasy, but the financial disclosures are the brutal reality. I ran my finger down the columns of numbers and felt a cold, sharp knot form in my stomach. Chase had already burned through $300,000 of initial seed capital. According to his own ledger, he had spent exorbitant amounts of money on luxury office space rentals, catered lunches for his 3 employees, and a dedicated public relations consultant. He had spent practically nothing on software development. But the burn rate was not the most shocking part. The truly terrifying revelation was buried in the liability section, detailing his secured debt. Chase had taken out a massive, high-yield business loan from a predatory commercial lender to keep the company afloat over the last 6 months. Because his business had 0 assets and 0 revenue, the lender required physical collateral. I stared at the address listed on the notarized loan agreement. It was the exact address of my childhood home in the Chicago suburbs. My father, Richard, had signed as the primary guarantor. My mother, Susan, had co-signed. They had literally bet the roof over their heads, the house where I grew up, the house where my father burned my college acceptance letters on a dog food application. I leaned back in my ergonomic desk chair and thought about the pure psychological sickness of my parents' favoritism. Why would a middle-aged man approaching retirement wager his entire physical safety net on a son with a documented history of total failure? Because in the wealthy American suburbs, the illusion of success is often more important than the reality of stability. Having an entrepreneur son who is the CEO of a tech startup sounds incredibly prestigious at the neighborhood country club. It sounds much better than admitting your 25-year-old son cannot keep a basic entry-level job and lives in your basement. My parents bought into Chase's delusion because admitting he was a catastrophic failure meant admitting their parenting strategy was fundamentally flawed. They had constructed their entire identity around his impending success. If he failed, they failed. So they doubled down. They risked their home to protect their pride. Vivian Vance walked into my office without knocking. She was wearing a sharp charcoal suit and holding her own copy of Chase's pitch deck. She dropped it onto my glass desk with a loud thud. "I have seen financial suicide notes before," she said, crossing her arms, "but this one is particularly creative. Did you run his projections through your predictive software?" I looked up at my mentor. "I did not even need the algorithm for this one," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly level. "The company is completely insolvent. According to the terms of his secured loan, if he does not secure $500,000 in equity funding by the last Friday of this month, he triggers a hard default. The commercial lender will initiate immediate foreclosure proceedings on the collateral properties." Vivian nodded slowly, her dark eyes calculating the exact trajectory of the ruin. "The collateral is a residential property in Illinois," she noted. "Do you know these people, Chloe?" I looked down at my father's signature on the loan document. The ink was aggressive and sharply slanted, just like his personality. "Yes, I know them," I said quietly. "The CEO is my older brother. The guarantors, who are about to lose their home, are my parents." Vivian did not gasp. She did not offer me pity. She was a shark, and she knew I was becoming one too. She simply raised a single, perfectly arched eyebrow. "I see," she said. "That explains why the financial architecture of this disaster feels so familiar to your baseline models. Do you want me to have my assistant send the standard rejection email? We can politely decline the investment and let the bank take their house. It would be a very quiet, very clean execution." I looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling concrete canyons of New York City. A quiet, clean execution was exactly what they deserved. I could have authorized the rejection email right then and there. I could have let the automated banking system destroy their lives while I sipped an iced coffee in my penthouse. But an email is invisible. An email allows the recipient to create their own narrative. If I sent a rejection email, my father would find a way to blame the venture capital industry. He would tell his country club friends that the Manhattan elites just did not understand his son's brilliant vision. He would never take responsibility for the fire he started. I thought about the night I left Chicago. I thought about standing in the living room, inhaling the smell of burning paper, watching my Harvard acceptance letter turn to ash. My father had looked me dead in the eye and told me I was required to sacrifice my future so my brother could succeed. I realized in that moment that a quiet execution was not going to be enough. I needed my father to look me in the eye when his delusions shattered. I needed him to know exactly who was holding the hammer. No, I said, turning back to Vivian, do not send the rejection email. Approve them for the next round. I want you to invite the CEO and his executive team to an in-person pitch meeting here at our headquarters. Vivian tilted her head, studying my face with a mixture of professional curiosity and deep amusement. You want to bring them into the building? She asked. You want to sit across a conference table and listen to your brother pitch a dog food app while your parents watch? They will not be pitching to the general board, I explained, my mind rapidly constructing the trap. When your assistant sends the invitation, tell them they have bypassed the standard review process. Tell them their pitch has been selected for an exclusive presentation to the firm's silent partner. They will think they have struck gold. They will think a billionaire angel investor wants to hand them a blank check. They will spend their last remaining dollars flying to New York and booking a luxury hotel room because they believe they have finally won. Vivian smiled. It was the terrifying, cold smile she only used right before she destroyed a rival firm in a corporate buyout. You are going to let them walk all the way into the slaughterhouse before you turn on the lights, she said. Exactly, I replied. The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday at 10 in the morning. For the next 5 days, I meticulously prepared for the ambush. I did not just read Chase's pitch deck. I weaponized it. I ran every single transaction from his company ledger through my predictive analytics software. The algorithm tore his business model apart. It flagged the luxury car lease he had disguised as a corporate marketing vehicle. It highlighted the expensive dinners at prime steakhouses that he had written off as client acquisitions, despite having absolutely no clients. I mapped out the exact geometry of his financial fraud. I printed the data visualizations and organized them into sleek black folders. I was not just going to reject his funding. I was going to forensically dismantle his ego in front of the man who had enabled it. The morning of the pitch, I woke up at 5. I stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirrors in my Tribeca penthouse and evaluated my reflection. I did not look like the terrified 20-year-old girl who had arrived at the Port Authority bus terminal with a duffel bag and $400. I looked like a junior partner at a ruthless Manhattan venture capital firm. I selected a pristine white tailored suit. It was structured sharp and completely unforgiving. It was the kind of suit that commanded a room the moment you walked through the door. I paired it with a silk blouse and a $10,000 Cartier watch that Vivian had gifted me when my software was acquired. I was dressing for a funeral. I arrived at the Vance Capitol building an hour early. I walked into the main boardroom on the executive floor. The room was intimidating by design. It featured a massive, polished mahogany conference table surrounded by black leather chairs. The entire back wall was made of glass, offering a dizzying vertical drop down to the streets below. I took my seat at the very head of the table, positioning myself so the natural light from the windows would cast me in silhouette when the doors opened. I placed the black folder containing Chase's financial autopsy perfectly centered on the wood in front of me. At exactly 10 in the morning, the receptionist's voice crackled over the intercom on my desk. "Ms. Davis," she said, "the executive team from Posh Paws has arrived for their presentation with the silent partner." "Send them in," I replied. My voice was as cold and clear as winter ice. I folded my hands, resting them on top of the black folder. I heard the heavy footsteps coming down the carpeted hallway. I heard my father's booming voice echoing confidently as he spoke to the receptionist. He sounded exactly the same, arrogant, entitled, and completely unaware that he was walking directly into a trap designed by the daughter he had thrown away. The heavy glass doors of the boardroom clicked unlocked and slowly swung open. I sat at the head of the massive mahogany conference table and waited for the trap to spring. The room was perfectly silent, except for the faint hum of the climate control system and the steady ticking of the Cartier watch on my left wrist. I had positioned my leather chair specifically so the morning sun reflecting off the neighboring Manhattan skyscrapers would cast me in a partial silhouette. It is a classic intimidation tactic I learned from watching Vivian dismantle rival executives. You blind your opponents slightly with the glare while keeping your own face entirely unreadable. I smoothed the lapels of my white tailored suit. My heart rate was a steady, resting 60 beats per minute. 5 years ago in my father's living room, I would have been trembling in terror. Today, I was a completely different species. I was the predator, waiting patiently for the prey to walk into the glass cage they built for themselves. The heavy mahogany doors swung open with a soft hydraulic hiss. My brother Chase walked in first. He was 28 years old now, but he carried himself with the nervous, desperate energy of a teenager who had forgotten to study for a final exam. He was wearing a navy blue suit that was slightly too large in the shoulders, and he was clutching a plastic presentation clicker in his sweaty hand like it was a life raft. Right behind him was my father. Richard Davis walked into the Vance Capital boardroom with his chest puffed out and his chin raised high. He was projecting the false confidence of a suburban patriarch who genuinely believed his mere presence commanded immediate respect. He looked around the massive room, taking in the expensive modern art and the dizzying panoramic views of the city with a hungry, greedy expression. He did not immediately focus on me sitting at the far end of the long table. He was too busy being impressed by the wealth he thought he was about to acquire. "Gentlemen," the receptionist said, gesturing toward the head of the table, "the silent partner will see you now." She stepped back into the hallway and pulled the heavy doors shut. The loud click of the magnetic lock echoed sharply in the cavernous room, locking them inside with me. My father turned his attention to the end of the table. He plastered a wide, practiced salesman's smile on his face and took 3 confident strides forward. "Thank you so much for taking the time to see us," he boomed. His voice echoed off the glass walls, filling the quiet space with unearned authority. "We represent Posh Paws, and we are incredibly excited to share our groundbreaking vision with you today." He extended his right hand, preparing for a firm, corporate handshake to seal his imaginary deal. Then the sunlight shifted and illuminated my face. My father stopped walking. His extended hand froze in midair. The practiced smile literally slid off his face, leaving behind a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. His eyes widened to an impossible size. He blinked rapidly, as if his brain was violently rejecting the optical information his eyes were sending him. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Chase bumped into my father's back because he was not looking up from his presentation notes. He stumbled, recovered his balance, and finally looked down the length of the table. Chase did not recognize me at first. I was wearing a suit that cost more than his entire marketing budget. My hair was styled in a sleek, professional blowout. I possessed an aura of absolute, untouchable authority. But then his eyes locked onto mine, and his jaw dropped open. "Chloe," he whispered, his voice cracking completely. "What are you doing here?" He looked around the empty boardroom, searching desperately for a logical explanation that did not involve me holding the keys to his future. "Why are you in this room? Are you the assistant for the partner? We need you to go get them right now. We have a massive presentation, and we cannot waste time." I did not stand up. I did not offer my hand. I simply placed my elbows on the polished mahogany and steepled my fingers together. I stared at them with eyes as cold as a winter ocean. "I am not the assistant, Chase," I said. My voice was calm, quiet, and completely terrifying. "I am the junior partner of this firm. I am the silent investor who requested this specific meeting, and your financials are a complete joke. Sit down, both of you. Let us talk about your catastrophic debt." My father let out a strange, choking sound. He stumbled backward and heavily dropped into one of the black leather chairs as if the bones in his legs had suddenly dissolved. Chase remained standing frozen in place, holding its plastic clicker like a shield. "Sit down, Chase," I commanded, my voice dropping a full octave. He flinched and collapsed into the chair next to my father. I opened the sleek black folder resting on the table in front of me. I did not ask them to begin their presentation. I did not let them speak. I simply started reading their financial autopsy out loud, dissecting their failure, line by bleeding line. "You are requesting $500,000 in Series A equity funding for a social networking application for purebred dogs," I said, looking directly at my father. "But according to your own ledger, you have 0 active users. You have 0 proprietary code. What you do have is a leased luxury vehicle, 3 expensive country club memberships written off as client outreach, and a predatory commercial loan with a hard default date of this coming Friday." I flipped a page, tapping my Cartier pen against a highlighted column of numbers. "You have burned through $300,000 of initial capital without writing a single line of viable software code. You paid a branding consultant $40,000 to design a logo, but you spent absolutely $0 on a server architect. This is not a tech startup, gentlemen. This is a highly disorganized financial fraud designed to subsidize a luxury lifestyle you cannot afford." My father finally found his voice. It was the same authoritative, demanding voice he used the night he burned my college acceptances in the fireplace. It was the voice of a man desperately trying to reclaim control of a narrative that had already slipped through his fingers. "Now you listen here, Chloe," he said, leaning forward and pointing a thick, trembling finger at me. "I do not know what kind of game you are playing or how you scammed your way into this fancy chair, but you are going to show your brother some respect. We came here for funding, and you owe this family your support. You have always been selfish and jealous of Chase. Now you are going to authorize this investment, or I will walk out of this room, speak to your boss, and have you fired immediately." I looked at his pointing finger. I felt absolutely nothing. No fear, no intimidation, just cold, clinical pity for a man who did not realize he was already dead. I held up a single manicured hand, silencing him instantly. "This is not your living room, Richard," I said coldly. "This is my boardroom. You do not give orders here. You do not set the rules. You do not get to throw tantrums when reality refuses to bend to your delusion. You are sitting in a building that I help control, asking for money that I personally manage. And you are begging for it because you are a spectacular financial failure." I closed the black folder with a sharp, violent snap that made both of them jump in their seats. "You co-signed a toxic, high-yield business loan using your suburban home as collateral to fund a dog food app," I continued. "When you trigger the hard default on Friday, the commercial lender is going to take your house. They will take your cars. They will liquidate your retirement accounts. You are entirely, completely bankrupt. You burned my future to keep him warm, and now you are both going to freeze to death." The absolute reality of my words finally pierced through my father's thick wall of arrogance. The fake confidence drained completely out of him, leaving behind a terrified old man. He looked at the closed folder on the table, then looked up at me with watering, desperate eyes. "Chloe, please," he begged, his voice suddenly high and thin. "You cannot do this to us. You cannot let us lose the house. We are your family. We raised you. You have to help your brother. He just needs a little more runway to make this work. We will pay you back. I promise we will pay you back." Chase was openly weeping now, wiping his nose with the back of his cheap suit sleeve. He looked like a small child who had just dropped his ice cream on the sidewalk. I stood up from my chair, buttoning the jacket of my white suit. "I do not have to do anything," I said, looking down at them from the head of the table. 5 years ago, you threw me away because you thought I was a burden. You burned my acceptance letters because you wanted to use me as an ATM to subsidize his failure. Well, I just audited his success. It is completely worthless. Your funding request is formally denied. You can find your own way out of my building." I turned my back on them and walked out of the boardroom, leaving my father and my brother completely paralyzed in the suffocating silence of their own ruin. But formally denying their funding and letting a random commercial bank evict them was entirely too merciful. An anonymous bank foreclosure would allow my father to play the victim. He would blame the economy. He would blame the ruthless financial system. He needed to understand the true specific cost of what he had done to me. I walked straight into my private office, picked up my desk phone, and dialed the direct line to Vivian's personal wealth manager. I instructed him to immediately contact the commercial lender holding the collateralized debt on my parents' house. I told him to purchase the debt in full using a blind holding company that I personally controlled. I was not going to let a faceless bank take their home. I was going to do it myself. 2 days later, I packed a small overnight bag and booked a first-class flight to Chicago. I was going back to the suburbs, and I was bringing the fire with me. I watched my father and my brother stumble out of the boardroom like two men who had just survived a violent car crash, only to realize they were still bleeding to death. They did not say another word to me. They did not scream or threaten or demand respect the way they used to when I lived under their roof. The sheer, suffocating weight of my wealth and the absolute reality of their bankruptcy had crushed the breath right out of their lungs. The heavy mahogany doors clicked shut behind them, sealing them out of my fortress and throwing them back into the unforgiving streets of Manhattan. I sat at the head of the conference table for a long moment, perfectly still, listening to the hum of the climate control system. I had just formally denied their funding and guaranteed the collapse of my brother's imaginary tech empire. But as I looked at the sleek black folder containing their financial ruins, I knew that simply letting a faceless commercial bank take their house was not going to give me the closure I demanded. A commercial bank foreclosure is a slow, bureaucratic process. It involves automated letters, unfeeling collection agents, and a sterile legal eviction. It gives desperate people like my father the opportunity to paint themselves as the tragic victims of a broken American financial system. He would spend the rest of his life sitting at bars, telling anyone who would listen that the banks destroyed his brilliant son's future. I was not going to allow him that comfort. I was not going to let him blame the economy or the ruthless nature of venture capital. I needed him to know with absolute, terrifying certainty that the architect of his destruction was the exact daughter he had thrown away. I picked up the phone on the conference table and dialed the direct line to the senior wealth manager at Vance Capital. When he answered, I gave him a very specific set of instructions. I told him to contact the predatory commercial lender holding the collateralized debt on my parents' suburban Chicago home. In the American financial system, toxic commercial debt is bought and sold on the secondary market every single day. When a borrower is weeks away from a hard default, lenders are often thrilled to sell the paper to a private equity firm just to get the liability off their books. I instructed my wealth manager to purchase my family's entire debt portfolio using a blind holding company that I completely controlled. I did not care what premium the bank demanded. I had millions of dollars in liquid capital, and I was about to use it to buy the physical roof over my abusers' heads. The transaction took less than 48 hours to clear. By Thursday afternoon, the digital ink was dry. The commercial bank transferred the deed of trust and the loan agreements to my holding company. I was no longer just the sister they discarded. I was legally their bank. I held the absolute unilateral power to initiate immediate foreclosure proceedings the second they missed their final deadline. With the legal trap permanently locked into place, I told Vivian I was taking a 3-day leave of absence. I went back to my Tribeca penthouse to pack. 5 years ago, I had packed a faded canvas duffel bag in the dark, terrified that my father would wake up and catch me. I had shoved 3 pairs of jeans and $400 into my pockets and fled into the night like a criminal. This time, I packed a pristine Louis Vuitton weekend bag. I packed a pair of designer sunglasses, a silk blouse, and a structured blazer. I was not sneaking out the back door anymore. I was flying first class back to the exact place where my future was supposed to burn, and I was bringing an inferno with me. To fully understand the gravity of what I was about to do, you have to understand the role my mother played in the Davis family dynamic. My father, Richard, was the loud, aggressive enforcer, but my mother, Susan, was the quiet, meticulous architect of the illusion. Susan cared about one thing above all else, and that was her social standing in our upper-middle-class Chicago suburb. She was the kind of woman who spent thousands of dollars on professional landscaping while actively ignoring the fact that her daughter was working 2 minimum-wage jobs just to afford college application fees. Susan never held the lighter the night my acceptance letters burned, but she handed my father the lighter fluid. She stood silently in the background, validating his cruelty, because sacrificing me was the only way to maintain the expensive fantasy that her son Chase was a genius. Susan's entire self-worth was tied to the physical appearance of that house. It was her country club credential. It was her proof that she was a successful mother. Taking that house away from her was going to sever her completely from her false reality. I landed at Chicago O'Hare International Airport on Friday morning. I did not call an economy rideshare service. I walked directly to the luxury exotic car rental desk and handed them my platinum corporate card. I requested the most aggressive, intimidating vehicle they had on the lot. 10 minutes later, I was handed the keys to a brand new slate gray Porsche Panamera. It was a low, wide machine that purred with a deep, guttural, mechanical growl. It was a car designed to turn heads and project absolute financial dominance. It was a car my father had spent his entire life dreaming about, but could never afford because he was too busy funding my brother's failures. I merged onto the highway and drove toward the suburbs. The physical landscape of my childhood rolled past the tinted windows. I passed the diner where I used to work double shifts, smelling like grease and cheap coffee. I passed the public library where I used to hide from my family to study for my advanced placement exams. Every street corner held a memory of exhaustion and anxiety. But as I gripped the leather steering wheel of the Porsche, those memories did not hurt anymore. They just felt like scenes from a movie about a girl who did not exist anymore. I had conquered this town the day I walked out of it, and now I was returning merely to collect my spoils. I turned onto my old street. The neighborhood was exactly how I remembered it. 2-story colonial houses, manicured green lawns, and luxury SUVs parked in wide driveways. But as I slowly approached my childhood address, the contrast became jarringly obvious. My parents' house stood out like a rotting tooth in a perfect smile. The financial bleeding of Chase's company had clearly taken a physical toll on the property. The white paint on the wooden siding was peeling in large, ugly strips. The gutters were sagging. The once immaculate front lawn was overgrown and patchy brown. They had completely run out of money to maintain the illusion. I pulled the slate gray Porsche directly into the driveway. I did not park on the street. I pulled right up onto their concrete, claiming the space with the loud, throbbing idle of the sports car engine. My mother, Susan, was standing in the front yard near the porch steps. She was holding a green garden hose, listlessly watering a row of completely dead brown hydrangeas. She was wearing a faded floral blouse, and her hair looked unkempt, a sharp departure from the polished country club woman I used to know. The stress of impending bankruptcy had aged her a decade in 5 years. When she heard the aggressive growl of the Porsche engine, she stopped watering. She stood perfectly still, staring at the $100,000 machine parked in her failing driveway. She probably thought it was a bank executive or a luxury debt collector coming to finalize the ruin of her family. She looked terrified, shrinking back toward the wooden porch steps as if trying to hide behind the dead bushes. I turned off the engine. The sudden silence in the suburban neighborhood was heavy and electric. I opened the heavy driver's side door and stepped out onto the concrete. I was wearing pristine beige tailored trousers, a cream silk blouse, and the $10,000 Cartier watch gleaming on my wrist. I slid my designer sunglasses up, resting them perfectly on top of my sleek hair. I closed the car door with a solid, expensive thud and turned to face the woman who had watched my Harvard acceptance letter turn to ash without saying a single word. Susan stared at me. Her eyes darted from the polished hood of the Porsche to my designer clothes and finally landed on my face. The human brain is a fascinating mechanism when it is presented with impossible information. It actively tries to reject what it is seeing. Susan squinted, her mouth falling open slightly as her mind struggled to reconcile the wealthy, powerful predator standing in her driveway with the invisible scapegoat daughter she had thrown away. The green plastic garden hose slipped entirely out of her hands. It hit the concrete driveway with a wet slap, spraying water aimlessly across the pavement. "Chloe," she whispered. The word barely made it past her lips. It sounded like a ghost trying to speak. She took one trembling step forward, her eyes wide with a mixture of absolute shock and a sudden, desperate, terrifying spark of hope. "Look at you. You look so—" I did not smile. I did not greet her. I reached into the passenger seat of the Porsche and pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope containing the absolute legal proof of their destruction. The sound of the dropping hose and my mother's gasp had broken the suburban silence. I heard the front door of the house unlock and the heavy footsteps of two men rushing toward the porch. The ambush was perfectly set, and the final execution was about to begin. The green plastic garden hose hit the concrete with a wet slap, spraying water aimlessly across the pavement. My mother, Susan, stood completely paralyzed on the overgrown lawn, staring at me. The human brain is a fascinating mechanism when it is violently confronted with impossible information. It actively tries to reject the visual data it is receiving. Susan squinted her eyes, and her mouth fell open slightly as her mind struggled to reconcile the wealthy, powerful predator standing in her driveway with the invisible scapegoat daughter she had thrown away 5 years ago. She took one trembling step toward the Porsche. She looked at my pristine tailored trousers, my cream silk blouse, and the heavy Cartier watch gleaming on my wrist. I could see the exact moment the gears in her mind shifted from absolute terror to a sudden, desperate, terrifying spark of hope. She probably thought I had experienced a massive change of heart after the boardroom massacre in New York. In her twisted, maternal logic, she likely believed I had flown all the way to Chicago in a $100,000 sports car to apologize to my father and offer my brother a multi-million-dollar bailout. "Chloe," she whispered, her voice shaking so badly it sounded like a dry leaf caught in the wind. "You came back. You look so beautiful. Look at this car. Look at you. We knew you would not just leave us. We knew you would remember your family." She reached her arms out, preparing to pull me into the kind of warm, motherly embrace she had actively denied me for my entire childhood. I did not move. I did not smile. I simply held up my left hand, palm facing outward, establishing an immediate, impenetrable physical boundary between us. "Do not touch me, Susan," I said. My voice was completely flat, devoid of any warmth or familial affection. The harshness of my tone and the use of her first name hit her like a physical blow. She recoiled, stumbling backward a few steps, until her heel caught the edge of the concrete driveway. Before she could say another word, the heavy wooden front door of the house was violently thrown open. My father, Richard, and my brother Chase burst out onto the front porch. The loud, aggressive growl of the Porsche engine had drawn them out of their miserable, impending ruin. They stopped dead at the top of the porch steps. They both looked utterly exhausted. My father was wearing a wrinkled polo shirt, and his face was unshaven. The artificial confidence he had projected in the Vance Capital boardroom just 2 days ago was entirely gone, replaced by the hollow, sunken look of a man who knew he was drowning in toxic debt. Chase was standing slightly behind him, peering over my father's shoulder like a frightened child hiding from a thunderstorm. They stared at the slate gray sports car parked aggressively on their property. Then their eyes tracked upward and locked onto me. For a few heavy, agonizing seconds, nobody breathed. The suburban neighborhood was perfectly quiet, except for the sound of the running garden hose spilling water onto the driveway. I noticed out of the corner of my eye that Mrs. Gable, the elderly neighbor who lived next door, had stopped retrieving her morning mail and was standing at the edge of her property, actively watching us. Susan noticed her too, and a deep flush of profound embarrassment crept up my mother's neck. Susan had spent her entire adult life curating the perfect upper-middle-class illusion for these neighbors, and now her ultimate failure was unfolding in broad daylight. My father finally broke the silence. To my absolute astonishment, his survival instinct completely overrode his shame. He actually tried to smile. He puffed out his chest and walked down the wooden porch steps, approaching me with the unearned, arrogant swagger of a patriarch who genuinely believed he was still in control. "Chloe," he said, his voice booming across the lawn in a desperate attempt to sound authoritative, "I knew you would come to your senses. That little stunt you pulled in the boardroom was incredibly disrespectful, but I told your brother you were just blowing off some steam. Family is family. I knew you would not let us lose the house. Come inside. Let us sit down at the kitchen table and figure out the transfer for the startup capital." The sheer, blinding audacity of his entitlement was almost beautiful. He was standing completely bankrupt on a dying lawn, practically begging for his financial life, and he was still trying to give me orders. He genuinely believed that the biological fact of his paternity granted him an all-access pass to my bank account. I did not step forward to meet him. I stayed perfectly planted next to the driver's side door of my car. I reached onto the passenger seat and picked up the thick, heavy manila envelope I had brought from New York. "I did not come here to save you, Richard," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the humid summer air. "I came here to deliver a message." My father stopped walking. He was 5 feet away from me. The fake smile vanished from his face instantly, replaced by a dark, defensive scowl. "What are you talking about?" he demanded. "You are my daughter. You have millions of dollars. You owe this family your support after everything we did for you." I looked at him with cold, clinical detachment. I opened the clasp of the manila envelope and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents printed on heavy, bonded paper. The Vance Capital logo was embossed at the top of the first page. I took 3 steps forward, invading his personal space, and shoved the entire stack of documents directly into his chest. He reflexively brought his hands up to grab them before they fell to the ground. "Read the first page," I commanded. My father looked down at the documents. His eyes scanned the heavy black text. I watched his pupils dilate. I watched the remaining color drain completely out of his face until he looked like a wax statue. His hands began to tremble so violently that the paper rustled loudly in the quiet air. "What is this?" he whispered. His voice was completely hollowed out. "That is the absolute, undeniable proof of your destruction," I said, keeping my tone perfectly conversational. "When I formally denied Chase's funding request on Tuesday, your company triggered a hard default on its commercial loan. Your lender immediately panicked. They realized you had 0 assets and 0 ability to pay back the hundreds of thousands of dollars you borrowed. In the American financial system, when a bank holds toxic debt, they sell it on the secondary market to mitigate their losses." I pointed a manicured finger at the document trembling in his hands. "I instructed my private wealth manager to contact your lender. I used a blind holding company that I personally control to purchase your entire debt portfolio at a premium. I bought the promissory note. I bought the deed of trust. I bought the lien on this property." Susan let out a sharp, strangled gasp behind him. Chase gripped the wooden railing of the porch, his knuckles turning entirely white. My father looked up from the papers. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving as his brain desperately tried to find a loophole, a way out, a way to reassert his dominance. But there are no loopholes in corporate debt acquisition. He was a small-town logistics manager who had tried to play a high-stakes game of venture capital, and he had been entirely outmaneuvered by the daughter he threw away. "You cannot do this," he choked out. "You cannot buy my house. It is illegal. It is family. It is a standard corporate acquisition." "Richard," I corrected him smoothly, "you offered this physical property as collateral for a high-yield business loan to fund a dog food application that had zero revenue. You bet the roof over your head on his delusion. You lost the bet, and the bank collected. I am the bank now." I walked past him, stepping onto the first wooden stair of the porch. I looked up at the large bay window that looked directly into their living room. I stared at the brick chimney rising above the roofline. 5 years ago, I said, my voice ringing with absolute finality, you stood in that exact living room, holding a silver lighter. You burned my Harvard acceptance letter. You burned Yale. You burned everything I worked for because you told me I had to sacrifice my future so Chase could have a quiet house to build his empire. You told me I was nothing but a supporting character in his story. I turned around to face them from the elevated position of the porch steps. I looked down at my father, who was clutching the foreclosure documents like a shield that could not protect him. "Well, I audited his empire," I said coldly. "It is completely worthless. He is a fraud, and you are bankrupt. And as of 9 o'clock this morning, I am the sole legal owner of this property." The silence that followed was absolute. The neighborhood had gone completely still. My parents and my brother were finally trapped in a reality they could not lie their way out of. But dropping the facts was only the first part of the reckoning. The true devastation was about to begin, because they still did not understand exactly what my ownership meant for their immediate future. And as my mother collapsed to her knees on the dying grass, crying hysterically, I prepared to deliver the final, ultimate boundary that would sever our ties forever. Susan was on her knees on the wet concrete. The water from the dropped garden hose was soaking into her expensive floral blouse, but she did not even seem to notice. For a woman who had spent her entire adult life terrified of a single blade of grass being out of place, watching her completely abandon her physical dignity was profound. She reached her hand out toward my beige trousers. I took a deliberate step backward, keeping my shoes entirely out of her reach. Susan started begging. She said she was sorry. She said she did not know how bad my father was treating me. It was the ultimate cowardice. Even now, in the face of absolute financial ruin, she was trying to rewrite history to make herself the victim. I looked down at her and calmly reminded her that she was the one who handed him the remaining 7 envelopes. She was the one who told me I was being selfish for wanting an education. I told her that her silence was just as violent as his lighter, and I was holding them both equally accountable for the ashes. Richard was still clutching the foreclosure documents against his chest like a bulletproof vest that had already failed. He looked at the paperwork and then looked at me. His brain was desperately trying to calculate a way out of a trap that had steel jaws. Richard was a man who spent his entire life bullying bank tellers, mechanics, and waitresses. He was accustomed to using his loud voice and aggressive posture to force the world to give him extensions and favors. He suggested a payment plan. He said he would come out of retirement. He said he would get a job managing a hardware warehouse and pay me back every single month until the debt was cleared. I did not raise my voice, but my words cut through the humid summer air like a scalpel. I told him the total collateralized debt was over $1.5 million. I broke down the brutal mathematics for him. I explained that even if he worked 80 hours a week for the rest of his natural life, his entire paycheck would not even cover the monthly interest generated by the principal loan. He had gambled his physical safety on high-yield venture capital money, and he had lost spectacularly. There was no payment plan that could fix a $1 million deficit. Then Chase finally spoke. My 28-year-old brother stepped forward from the porch. His face was red and blotchy. He tried to puff out his chest and used the same demanding, entitled tone he had used our entire lives. He told me I was being entirely unreasonable. He said I was destroying the family over a childhood grudge. He demanded that I forgive the loan because his dog food application was just one major coding update away from becoming profitable and saving them all. I turned my full attention to Chase. I looked him up and down, analyzing him the same way my software analyzed a failing corporate asset. I told him he did not know how to code. I told him his daily active user base was 0. I revealed that I had seen his entire corporate ledger during the audit. I told him I knew he had spent $20,000 of the loan money on a luxury vacation to Miami disguised as a networking event. I knew about the expensive leased sports car he hid in a downtown parking garage. I told him he was not a brilliant tech entrepreneur. He was just a terrified thief wearing a cheap suit, stealing money from his own parents to pretend he was important. Chase closed his mouth. He had absolutely no defense. The illusion was completely shattered. In the real world, outside the protective bubble of this suburban house, his incompetence was glaringly obvious and mathematically proven. I reached into the manila envelope still resting on the passenger seat of my car and pulled out a single sheet of bright yellow paper. It was a formal 30-day notice to vacate the premises. I walked up the porch steps and handed it directly to Chase, forcing him to hold the physical reality of his failure. I explained the strict eviction laws in the state of Illinois. I told them they had exactly 30 days to pack whatever personal belongings the bankruptcy courts allowed them to keep and leave the property. I advised them to start looking for cheap rental apartments immediately. If they were still inside the house on day 31, I would have the county sheriff physically remove them and place their belongings on the curb for the entire neighborhood to see. Susan let out a horrifying wail from the driveway. It was a sound of pure social agony. She looked up at me with mascara running down her face. She asked me what I was going to do with the house. She begged me to just keep it in the family name. She said she could not bear the thought of her country club friends seeing a stranger living in her home. She said the public humiliation of a bank foreclosure sign on the front lawn would literally kill her. That was the exact moment I delivered the final devastating blow. It was the unexpected payoff that would permanently sever her from the community she valued more than her own daughter. I looked down at my mother and delivered the cold, hard facts. I told her I was not going to sell the house to another wealthy suburban family. I told her I had already signed a preliminary agreement with a local nonprofit organization that specialized in building transitional housing for emancipated foster youth and runaway teenagers. 5 years ago, I had been forced to run away from this exact property in the middle of the night with nothing but a duffel bag and $400. I told my mother I was going to bulldoze her pristine 4-bedroom colonial and rezone the 2-acre lot to build a multi-unit safe haven for kids who had no safety net. Susan stopped crying. She stopped breathing entirely. The blood completely drained from her face. In her elitist upper-middle-class world, property values and neighborhood exclusivity were the ultimate religion. I was not just taking her house. I was destroying her entire legacy. I was going to force her wealthy, judgmental friends to watch a halfway house get built on the exact spot where she used to host her exclusive summer garden parties. Her social standing in the town of her dreams was about to be permanently annihilated, and everyone would know it was her own daughter who ordered the demolition. It was the perfect poetic justice. Richard dropped the foreclosure documents onto the wooden porch. The heavy pages scattered across the floorboards, blowing slightly in the warm summer breeze. He leaned heavily against the wooden railing, looking like a man who had just been handed a terminal diagnosis. He finally understood that there was absolutely no way to bully or negotiate his way out of this trap. The power dynamic had permanently shifted. He was completely at my mercy, and I had none left to give. I turned my back on them. I did not ask for an apology because an apology from them was worthless currency. I walked down the wooden porch steps for the very last time. My beige trousers brushed past my mother, who was still kneeling silently on the wet concrete. She did not reach for me again. The psychological weight of what was about to happen to her neighborhood had completely paralyzed her. I opened the heavy door of the slate gray Porsche Panamera and slid into the driver's seat. The leather was cool and smelled like expensive new money. I put my designer sunglasses back over my eyes, shielding myself from the blinding afternoon sun. I pressed the ignition button, and the engine roared to life, shattering the quiet suburban atmosphere one final time. As I put the car into reverse, I looked out the tinted window. My father was staring blankly at the scattered legal documents on the porch. My brother was crying silently, holding the yellow eviction notice. My mother was still on the ground, surrounded by the dead hydrangeas she could no longer afford to water. It was a perfect portrait of consequence. I backed out of the driveway and smoothly transitioned onto the asphalt street. I did not look in the rearview mirror. I drove away from the wreckage of my biological family, leaving them to navigate the catastrophic storm they had entirely created for themselves. The conflict was finally over. The debts were paid in full, and my ledger was completely clean. But the story does not end simply with walking away. It ends with what you build in the empty space they leave behind. People constantly ask me if I felt a single ounce of guilt driving away from my childhood home that afternoon. They wonder if looking through the tinted windows of that sports car and seeing my mother crying helplessly on the wet concrete driveway made me second-guess my actions. They ask if I ever considered turning the car around and offering them a fraction of my wealth just to ease their suffering. The answer is absolutely not. Guilt is an emotion strictly reserved for people who owe a debt or who have caused unjust, intentional harm. I owed my biological family absolutely nothing. They spent 18 years treating me like a disposable resource, like an unpaid servant designed entirely to subsidize my older brother's delusions. I did not actively destroy them. I simply stepped out of the way and allowed them to experience the exact natural consequences of their own horrific financial decisions. As I navigated the Porsche back toward the highway heading for the airport, the physical sensation in my body was not regret. It was an overwhelming, profound sense of lightness. The heavy, suffocating atmospheric pressure of the Davis family dynamic had finally completely evaporated from my life. I returned the rental car at the airport terminal and boarded my first-class flight back to New York City. I drank a glass of sparkling water, watched the clouds break over the American Midwest, and closed the book on my childhood forever. I know a lot of people make grand, dramatic threats in the heat of an emotional argument and never actually follow through with them. But I am an architect of algorithms, and I operate strictly on data precision and execution. I do not make empty threats. Exactly 30 days after I handed my brother that yellow eviction notice on the front porch, my private corporate security team and the local county sheriff arrived at the property to ensure the premises were completely vacated. My parents and Chase were entirely gone. They had managed to scrape together enough money to rent a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in a far less prestigious zip code on the other side of the county. My father was forced to take a job as a shift manager at a hardware warehouse, and my brother was working the cash register at a local electronics store. The sprawling suburban colonial house where my father had arrogantly burned my college acceptances was entirely empty. 2 weeks later, the demolition crew arrived at the property. I actually flew back to Chicago just for the occasion. I stood on the sidewalk across the street holding a hot cup of coffee and watched the heavy yellow bulldozers tear the brick fireplace right out of the center of the house. I watched the roof cave in and the pristine white siding splinter into 1,000 pieces. It was one of the most deeply satisfying moments of my entire adult life. Today, if you drive past that exact address, you will not see a manicured country club lawn or a luxury house hiding toxic secrets. You will see a beautiful, modern, multi-unit housing facility designed specifically for emancipated foster youth and teenagers escaping abusive homes. It is fully funded and maintained by my holding company. I took the exact physical space where my future was supposed to die, and I turned it into a secure launch pad for kids who desperately need a safe place to build their own futures. Sometimes the most profound act of self-love is allowing toxic people to face the exact destruction they built for themselves. I did not need to save my parents because I had already saved myself. And I did not do it entirely alone. I built a new family in New York City, a chosen family. My mentor, Vivian Vance, taught me that biological blood does not automatically grant someone a permanent VIP seat at your table. Vivian showed me what actual unconditional support looks like in the real world. She did not demand that I shrink myself to make her feel powerful. She demanded that I rise to meet my own limitless potential. She taught me that true power in this society is not about screaming the loudest in a suburban living room or bullying your children to stroke your own ego. True power is about being the person who quietly holds the pen that signs the final, legally binding contract. Today, I sit on the executive board of one of the most ruthless and successful venture capital firms in Manhattan. I am surrounded by brilliant, driven people who celebrate my victories and challenge my mind. I am respected, I am valued, and I am entirely untouchable. When you grow up as the designated scapegoat in a toxic family system, it is incredibly easy to internalize their abuse. For years as a teenager, I honestly believed that I was the root cause of the problem. I thought if I just got better grades, if I just worked a little harder, if I just stayed out of the way, maybe they would finally love me the way they loved Chase. But looking at my family through the clinical, objective lens of adult hindsight, I finally understand the psychological reality of what they were doing. It is a psychological concept called conditional self-worth. My parents were deeply insecure, terrified people who used my brother as a shiny object to distract the world from their own profound mediocrity. They desperately needed Chase to be a genius so they could feel important at their country club. And they needed me to be a failure so they had a baseline to compare him against. My achievements threatened the entire structural integrity of their delusion. My father did not burn my acceptance letters because he hated me. He burned them because he was absolutely terrified of me. He knew that if I was allowed to succeed, I would eventually outgrow them, outsmart them, and expose the undeniable truth that he was a failure. Their rejection was never a reflection of my actual worth. It was simply a reflection of their own deep, unfixable brokenness. If you are watching this video right now, and you are currently trapped in a house where your achievements are actively ignored and your boundaries are constantly disrespected, I need you to listen to me very carefully. You are not a burden. You are not a backup plan. And you are absolutely not a sacrificial lamb meant to be slaughtered for a golden child's fragile ego. The people who are supposed to protect you might try to burn your future to keep themselves warm, but they can only destroy what you allow them to find. So hide your acceptance letters, hide your money, pack your canvas duffel bag in the dark while they are sleeping, walk away in total silence, and do not ever look back. Build your fortress brick by brick in the shadows where they cannot reach you. Because success is not just the best revenge. It is the only mirror large enough to force your abusers to look at their own pathetic reflections. You have the fundamental right to walk away. You have the right to build a massive empire. And you have the right to lock the heavy glass doors once you reach the absolute top. Thank you so much for listening to my story and staying with me until the very end. If this story resonated with you, if you have ever had to cut toxic ties to save your own life, please hit that subscribe button and drop a heart in the comments below. I read every single one of your messages, and your direct support helps these stories reach the exact people who desperately need to hear them today. Also, please check the description box below, where I have linked several other incredible videos about surviving toxic families, setting unbreakable boundaries, and claiming the beautiful life you actually deserve. Remember, you are the only author of your own story. Never let anyone else hold the pen. I will see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves. Although it can be profoundly devastating to realize that the people who share your DNA, the very parents who were supposed to protect, nurture, and celebrate your potential, might instead view your brilliance as a threatening shadow cast upon their preferred golden child, forcing you to endure the heartbreaking experience of watching your incredible achievements literally reduced to ashes in a suburban fireplace, just to keep their fragile illusions of superiority warm. The ultimate lesson of this journey is that you are never permanently bound to the toxic roles assigned to you in a dysfunctional home. Rather, you possess the absolute, undeniable power to pack your bags in the dark of night, walk away from the suffocating expectations of people who only value you as a disposable resource, and quietly build an untouchable fortress of success from the ground up, proving that true family is not determined by biological obligation, but by the people you deliberately choose to surround yourself with. Loyal mentors, friends, and allies who challenge your mind and celebrate your victories without condition. So that when the day inevitably comes that your abusers are forced to face the catastrophic consequences of their own deeply flawed, entitled decisions, you can stand safely on the other side of an impenetrable boundary, completely free from guilt, fully realizing that walking away was not an act of vengeance, but the most profound act of personal love imaginable. And if this powerful message of reclaiming your narrative, severing toxic ties, and building the beautiful, successful life you actually deserve resonates with your own experiences of survival and triumph, please remember to like this video, leave a comment sharing your own journey of breaking free, and subscribe to Olivia Tells Stories for more empowering narratives that remind you that you author your future.